Hello and welcome. Hello and welcome to IMF Inspired. Today I'm privileged to introduce Reshma Saujani, a tireless campaigner for women's and girls' economic rights, the author of 2 international bestsellers and a mother of 2. Welcome, Reshma. Reshma, a first-generation Indian American, sets an inspiring example, training 500,000 girls around the world in computer skills to bridge the tech gender divide, and is also advocating for a Marshall Plan to improve conditions for working mothers. In that same spirit, the discussion today focuses on one of the glaring inequalities magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic, the difficulties faced by women, especially by mothers, the mom's emergency. We learn a lot through working with our member countries and hearing experiences on the ground. It is clear that the pandemic has robbed mothers of their hard-won financial progress. And sadly, this is affecting women everywhere in all regions. One IMF study focuses on sub-Saharan Africa. It demonstrates that when women lose income, this also spills over onto their children, harming future generations. We also have analysis which finds that in the United States, women with young children were most affected by this crisis. They experienced greater unemployment and a slower return to paid work than men or women without children. With schools closed and other safety measures in place, the pandemic also put an extra childcare burden on women. Our estimates showed this may have reduced total US output by about 0.4% between April and November 2020. At the same time, there are many studies by the IMF and by others that show the significant macroeconomic gains that are possible when women are able to participate fully in the economy. That's why it is absolutely imperative to address the large gender gaps that have worsened substantially during the pandemic and have reversed years of progress. We have made great progress in recent years in stepping up our work on gender equality and how it relates to economics. And we are evaluating how to make women-centric policies an even more integral part of our work at the IMF. Our goal is to apply a gender lens to our surveillance, policy advice, capacity development, to help member countries be more responsive to gender equality in their macroeconomic and financial policies. And I hope that today's discussion will make a valuable contribution to our search for ways to build forward better, an inclusive global economy that works for women everywhere, an outcome that benefits everyone. Reshma, we wish you the best on your ambitious mission to economically empower and technologically support skills for girls and women as we look forward to hearing more about your inspiring work. Leading the discussion today is our fabulous Sabina Bhatia, Deputy Secretary of the IMF. As the curator of this IMF-inspired conversation series, Sabina is bringing together diverse global voices whose work and commitment to excellence is changing the world for the better. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Reshma and Sabina. Over to you, Sabina. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristalina. A very warm welcome to you, Reshma. We are delighted that you're joining us today. The pandemic has been devastating for working women. In the US alone, 2.4 million women have dropped out of the workforce. Working moms in particular have been hard hit, especially Black women, women of color, and minimum wage earners. Reshma, you launched the Marshall Plan for Moms. Tell us about your plan and why this is a pivotal moment.
Yeah, I mean, women have gotten crushed in the pandemic, not just here in the United States, but globally. And the reason why women were literally pushed out of the labor force is one, many women, especially low income women, found themselves in jobs that weren't pandemic proof, like retail, healthcare, and education. And when the pandemic hit, they lost their jobs. The second thing is that many women, because our care structure is broken and because schools were shut down, many women had to supplement essentially their paid labor for unpaid labor because they were doing the cooking and the cleaning and doing the grocery shopping and doing the homeschooling. And so this essentially forced them out of the labor force. So essentially, in September of 2020, many moms like me were simply saying, well, when the schools open, everything will be okay. And I remember for me, I got a note 2 weeks before the schools were supposed to open that my son's kindergarten was going to be closed. And they were going to be supplementing it with something called hybrid learning, which clearly was not created by a woman, where you would have to log on your kid at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and 11 o'clock on Zoom, all the while you were supposed to maintain your full-time job. And so what you started seeing happen, both here in the United States and globally in that September, October, and November, were that women started leaving the labor force because it was just untenable. In December of 2020, all the jobs lost were women and women of color. And I remember looking at that jobs report and thinking, well, someone's got to have a plan. I mean, you can't lose 30 years of jobs progress in 9 months and think that it's an on and off switch. And when I looked up, I realized that, well, nobody had a plan. And so I wrote one and I talked to the moms, in my parent teacher association. And I said, well, what do you need to go back to work? And that was the Marshall Plan for Moms. And it was very simple. When I talked to moms, they said, I need a handful of things. One, I need cash. I need money in my pocket so I could pay for shoes, maybe a tutor, help with the daycare center that is open. I need cash because not all of our situations are the same. And different moms needed different things. Secondly, mom said is, I need paid leave. In those early months in March, if we had paid leave here in the United States, people wouldn't have gone to work sick. They would have been able to take time off and make those choices. Third, we need affordable childcare. Childcare in this country and across the globe is way too expensive. My parents were refugees and my dad couldn't afford the $50 a week for childcare. And so I was a latchkey kid. Remember when they used to tie the key around your neck and you would walk, the 20 blocks home? So many parents had to make untenable choices because they couldn't afford the childcare. We needed schools to open up safely. And finally, because so many women, 3 times more women than men, were in jobs that were low-wage jobs that weren't pandemic-proof, like retail and education, they needed retraining. 70% of low-income moms here in the United States are women of color, and they're the single breadwinner and the single caretaker. So if we're going to help them march back up into the middle class, we have to retrain them for the jobs of the future.
So you came up with this Marshall Plan for Moms. And then what did you do with this plan?
Well, we put a full-page ad in the New York Times addressed to President Biden, and we said that moms don't work for free, and we need a plan. And we followed that up with a letter that was from 100 prominent women, from celebrities like Gabrielle Union to Amy Schumer, to activists like Ai-jen Poo, to business leaders like Mindy Grossman and Jennifer Hyndman. And we followed that up with a letter from, a handful of 50 men saying, to Congress, saying, our mothers don't work for free. What are you going to do? And, since then, we've had a handful of bills introduced in Congress, in states and localities, calling for a Marshall Plan for Moms, calling for affordable childcare, paid leave, fixing the structure of care, cash payments to mothers. We've put out a playbook to employers showing them, here's what you need to do in order to return women back to work. We've had culture shifting campaigns because, again, you don't value what you don't pay for. And so many mothers are treated like martyrs. We're doing the unpaid work and we're not being paid for it. That work is not being valued and no one seems to care. And, a year and a half later, I was just, watching CNN before, we started our conversation, and the September jobs report has just come out. 305,000 women have left the labor force. 184,000 men entered it. A year and a half later, years later, we are literally in the same exact spot. We have done nothing to support women. We have done nothing to help them enter the workforce. We have done nothing to value the role that they play in society and in our economy.
So what needs to be done now?
As you know, there's a bill being, debated in Washington right now. President Biden has put forth a plan, Build America Back Better, that includes affordable childcare, that includes passing paid leave. The United States is one of the only industrialized nations that doesn't offer paid leave. We need a child tax credit, which are those payments, right, to parents, to help them support care. But we need to rebuild that structure. And then the private sector has to step up. The reason why we call this the Marshall Plan for moms is it's not just a government intervention. The private sector needs to stand up. Families need to stand up. Culture needs to shift, and the government needs to do something. But I don't know about you, but I want to finish this fight once and for all. And we've been fighting for gender equality for far too long. And, before the pandemic hit, we had made some real progress. Those of us in this space were just, we were excited, and now it feels like all the work that we've done, all the gains that we have made are being rolled back. And there's not being enough attention being put forth in this, both in the United States and globally, because this situation isn't happening to American women alone. It's happening across the globe.
Right, exactly. Let me share with you another headline number, 54 million. That's 54 million women who left the workforce globally because of the pandemic. And they left it for many of the same reasons that you just mentioned, increased childcare responsibilities. They were in the retail sector, in tourism, hospitality, which was devastated by the pandemic. But in addition, many women, especially in developing countries, are in the informal economy. And my question is, Reshma, what do you think that needs to be done to get women in developing countries back to work?
Yeah, and Oxfam had a stat that was, $800 billion, of economic loss, essentially, during the pandemic of women globally. That's a lot of money, right? That's a lot of economic value. And, I think in the developing world, there's three major things. I think one, there is a movement to call for cash payments. You're seeing this movement happen in India, that when women are in the informal economy, the vast majority of them, are doing 86% of the unpaid labor at home. And that labor means something. There should be a value to it. And governments across the world should value that labor, and women should receive payments for that. And that's happening in Canada and the UK. It needs to happen globally. I think secondly, those women need benefits. They need health care. They need their child care to be subsidized. They need paid leave. They need to make sure that they also can have the benefits so that they can work in society. And I think finally, we got to have a global conversation about how we shift the conversation around gender equality in the home. The Philippines had this amazing movement where they had a whole PSA campaign that laundry is love. And what they were trying to do was encourage more men in the Philippines to do the laundry. The reason why so many women are still in the informal, sector is because they're doing all of that work at home, and they don't have the time or the bandwidth to use their skills to work in the formal sector. The only way we change that is by shifting the gender equality and the ratio of work that's done at home. We should get to 50-50 and not 86%. And governments should start implementing plans and programs to help push that, equation to move in that direction.
Speaking of governments, so, the finance ministers of the world are gathering together at the IMF annual meetings in the coming days. And top of their mind will be recovery from the crisis. So, Reshma, if you had one ask to make of the ministers of finance, what would that be?
Listen, we cannot recover if we leave half of our populations behind. And those half of our populations are women. And so every finance minister should appoint a woman's job czar. And literally his or her job is to look at every city, every state, every municipality and say, how many women have left? Mm-hmm. And how do I get back to 51%? What are the levers that I'm going to pull? Am I going to make a cash payment? Am I going to provide childcare? Am I going to do retraining? What is it going to take to get the full participation of our population to participate in the labor force and to do it better than we were doing it before? Women always had to make unconscionable choices for their mental health, you know what I mean, for their own dreams and desires, you know, to participate in the workforce. We should build it back better, you know, across the globe. And I think every finance minister has the opportunity to make a commitment to do that. Let's not take another 50 years, another 100 years to make the progress that we were making, you know, in gender equality. Let's do it in a handful of years.
So the women's job czar, they would be looking at the recovery through a gender lens.
Correct.
So every aspect of the recovery, all the programs, etc.
Absolutely.
That's a radical idea.
It's a radical idea, but we can do it.
Okay, speaking of the recovery, we hear a lot about labor shortages. It seems to be that there are lots of job openings, but workers don't want to apply for those jobs. So this would be a moment in which I think women have a great deal of leverage, bargaining power over their employers. So what should women be asking for as they get back to work?
Look, I think that, and that we wrote about a lot of these things in our playbook, and I think it's very important to not just have a conversation about, you know, white collar workers. So, you know, I think what women need, and we did a report on this, is one, either flexibility or predictability. So if you are working as a banker or a lawyer, you want to have flexibility. You know, you want to be able to kind of dictate your schedule, whether that's 2 days in the office or 3 days in the office. I mean, for so long, so many of us, you know, had to hide our children because having a child was seen as not being committed to your job. And there literally is a motherhood penalty, you know, that supports that. You know, mothers are paid less than fathers for doing the exact same work because as a mom, you're seen as less committed. As a father, you're seen as being, you know, a rock star worker. That has to change. And I think part of that changes by offering flexibility. I think for hourly workers, that comes in the form of predictability. If you work at Walmart or Target and you have a 7 p.m. shift, you've done everything to prepare for that. You've, you know, hired a babysitter or made the payment to your childcare center. You show up for your 7 p.m. shift and guess what? It's canceled. There's no compensation back to you. You are simply just out. So what many women we talk to that are hourly workers, they say, give me predictability. Give me the opportunity to manage my own schedule. Secondly, you know, as we talked about this, I think that companies should lead the way in providing affordable childcare. You know, we don't argue about whether public education is important. Our kids need to be educated. They need to be in school. But every study has shown across the globe that 0 to 4, those are the critical years. And so if we're going to provide public education, we should provide public childcare. We should pay for that as a society. And the private sector should lead the way in that really, you know, societal shift and saying we value our workers and we're going to pay for childcare. And it shouldn't just happen for, you know, salaried employees. It should happen for hourly employees as well.
Right, right. So speaking about employers, you know, lots of organizations are looking to adopting hybrid ways of working. And we at the IMF are also doing that. And we're still trying to figure out how to make it work. So what should employers do to build a better workplace in the future? One that, you know, is flexible, predictable, as you just mentioned, but also for women, but also for parents generally, because men also want flexibility.
Absolutely.
But also something that works for employers as well.
Yeah, I mean, first, you know, I'm really glad you said that because I think that's right. What's good for moms is good for everybody.
Right.
Right? It's good for dads. It's good for, you know, childless parents, and everybody wants this. First, I think companies have to stop being resistant to going back to normal. There is no going back to normal. And guess what? Normal wasn't working. You know, and this year and a half, like I said, you know, when I before the pandemic, I used to spend 45 minutes with my kids a day, 45 minutes. And I was okay with that. You know, I'm not going back to that. I'm never going back to that. And today I am more productive being able to take my son to his music class, you know, or, you know, cook roti, right? And make dinner for my kid or do nighttime duties. And I'm just as productive as I was before. So I think this myth that you have to have FaceTime and literally sit at your desk, and that's the only way of measuring productivity, that's just simply not true. And so we have to be open to flexibility and open to, you know, creating health and happiness with our employees. That should be a value as well. And so I just think that this is all going to fundamentally shift. Instead of being resistant to it, we should literally accept it and figure out how to make it work.
Right, right. No, I like your point that there's no going back to the pre-pandemic way of working or living.
And there's benefits. And I want to say one last thing, because going back to this idea of like gender equality, you know, I am really passionate about this idea that I think that companies should literally be tying performance reviews and salary compensation to whether the men, in their offices took paternity leave.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you take paternity leave, that helps change the gender equation of who's doing what at home. And so we have an opportunity in this moment too to change that balance of the unpaid labor in the equation, which I think will bring more women, into levels of leadership, into levels of equality. And so again, let's look at this as an opportunity, to shift things for the better.
Right, right. So as a manager yourself, how are you supporting the women who work with you?
Well, one, I think we're asking them, what do you need? What do you need? For most of them, schools are still very unstable. So people are not back in the office, and, we allow people to kind of set their own hours. So there is no FaceTime. You have to be on from 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock and, cameras on. Secondly, there is no motherhood penalty. For so many moms, when their kids are interrupting and all of a sudden, everyone's whispering behind their back and saying, well, they're not productive. They're not committed to their work. We're very intentional, about looking at that. And I think every company should do that audit. Are mothers and fathers paid the same? And third, what are the types of benefits that we're offering, families today? Our offices childcare is very expensive in New York. It shouldn't be more than 7% of the income that you pay, but it's vastly more expensive than that. So again, what are our values, and how are we embedding that in our corporate culture?
Okay. Reshma, you've been a pioneer in other ways as well. You started Girls Who Code as a way of bridging gender inequities in the tech sector. Are you worried that the digital gender divide has worsened in the pandemic?
It's been a brutal year for kids across the globe. So many of my students, were getting Wi-Fi in Burger King parking lots. Had one device to share between a family of 3. Moms were essential workers, and so, they weren't able to log on to school. We don't talk enough about having a 2-generational strategy towards poverty alleviation. And, 1.6 million girls are also caretakers, for their siblings or their nephews or their nieces. And that interferes in their ability to study computer science. We don't have a plan for that. So I think that this was a devastating year in terms of learning loss for many students. But what we did at Girls Who Code is, we've always said this, how do we teach our most vulnerable? We go into refugee camps and say, how do we teach her? We go into, impoverished communities that have disparate Wi-Fi and say, how do I teach you how to code? We go into with our students who are essential workers and say, how do we design a program that allows you to be self-paced so you can do it at a time that works for you? So what ended up happening is we ended up teaching more girls of color, more girls under the poverty line, because we really innovated and thought about virtual learning as an opportunity to teach the most vulnerable. Now, some school districts have done this. Some schools across the world have done this, but many have not because they haven't had the resources, to do that. We were talking about this. I mean, Wi-Fi is like water.
Right.
Literally. You can't live without it. And so we should be figuring out how every single kid, irregardless of your race, irregardless of your socioeconomic status, has high-speed internet. Not just internet, high-speed internet. And they should have the ability to learn. The world has radically changed, in terms of this learning. And so we should meet the moment. And we have to meet the moment by literally slamming the digital divide. One should not exist.
Right. And in many countries, of course, Wi-Fi issues are big issues, right? And on top of that, there's a cultural bias. So if you have one device, who are you going to give it to?
The boy.
Your son or your daughter, right? So how do you deal with that?
Well, this is why, we've created a global movement to teach girls to code by really saying that it shouldn't be your son or your daughter. It should be both. Right. That we have to let girls learn, and we need to. I mean, if we want to solve COVID, climate, or cancer, we need half of our population. We need our girls, learning, leading, educating. This is the moment, and we've learned that, and this is why I think what's happened over the past year and a half has been so heartbreaking, is because we've lost that progress, and our girls are now at home, caretaking, because we don't have structures of care. We don't have systems that are working, for women and girls. And so we have to, we have to meet this moment by not simply just doubling down in our commitment, to fixing the problem of care, but also to making sure that we have not lost the progress that we were made in terms of girls' education. You know, every organization, every government should be doubling down on making sure that the girls in their community are learning at high rates and at the same rates as boys.
So this brings me to my next question. I was reading your book, Brave Not Perfect, and I would highly recommend it to all the moms and dads out there. Don't bring up your girls as princesses, right? So, and you were talking about how girls are conditioned not to take risks, to be in their comfort zone, and a lot of that resonated with me. And I was struck in particular by something you said in one of your, I think it was a podcast. You said, surround yourself with rejection. You will immunize yourself from the fear of failure. Wow. So talk to us about your own experience with failure and how you dealt with it.
So you know, I was the daughter of refugees, and, you know, we say in our culture, right, like, what's your dharma? And I always felt like because this country literally saved my parents' life, like I wanted a life of service. You know, I graduated $300,000 in student loan debt. I went to go work in finance, and I felt just stuck because I wasn't living my dharma. I wasn't serving. And so I decided, with my father's blessing, to just quit and to run for United States Congress. I was the first South Asian American woman to ever run for United States Congress. I had no idea what I was doing. I remember we raised like $50,000 from Indian aunties that were just so happy an Indian girl was running for Congress. But it was the best experience of my life. And I lost spectacularly. It wasn't even close. But what was really interesting is when I woke up the next morning, you know, the first thing I thought to myself was like, wow, like I'm not broken. Like I'm not broken. I think for so long, for so many of us, if we think that if we try something and we fail at it, that it will literally break us. So we give up before we even try. So losing that race, losing the thing that since I was literally a little girl, I had dreamed about, the fact that that didn't break me, it made me, in fact, say the opposite and say to myself, well, what are the other things that I talked myself out of? What are the other things I thought that I couldn't do? And it's what inspired me to start Girls Who Code, a movement to teach girls to code when I didn't code and I didn't even bother to learn. And so what I realized from that is that failure is a privilege. Like failure is a gift because you learn so much by failing. And it also brings you closer to what we say, you know, what you're meant to do. So many girls, because we're raised to be perfectionists, we don't have the gift of failure. You know, I'm obsessed with Serena Williams. And she literally sits at the edge of her ability in a coach who's saying, do it again, do it again, do it again. Like if you want to be great, you got to fail. You got to iterate. You got to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and try and fail again and again. So if you're raised to be a perfectionist, you are constantly not given that gift of failure. And what's the beauty of coding is such a process of iteration, that annoying semicolons in the wrong place, you got to do it again and again and again. So it literally teaches you to fail. It builds bravery as if it's a muscle. And, you know, especially in this moment, you know, so many people in the US in the pandemic, it was like almost, if you hadn't built resiliency, if you hadn't failed, if you hadn't suffered, what we've gone through over the past year and a half was just too much. And so failure is literally something that we should be teaching, but it has to be accessible to all. You know, in my world in Silicon Valley, failure is very accessible if you're a male and you're white and you're Asian, right? Not accessible if you're a woman or a person of color. A lot of judgment if you miss a quarter, make a mistake, lose an election. Suddenly that is just your whole life. I guess you couldn't do it. I guess you couldn't handle it. But if it's guy, it's like, wow, that built chutzpah, you know, that built some muscle and experience. And so again, I think we have to shift this notion of who gets to fail and who doesn't.
Wow. Failure is a gift. You gave me goosebumps, Reshma. So you go, girl. As an Indian auntie, can I say all the best to you? So this is a good note for us to end on. Thank you very much, Reshma, for inspiring us, for advocating for moms, and for being such a change maker. Thank you, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
The pandemic has taken a huge toll on women, especially moms. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to change the status quo. Will we seize this moment to reimagine the workplace to make it truly work for women? Can we build something better, fairer, more equitable? Let me leave you with that question. Thank you for joining us. From the IMF in Washington, D.C., this is Sabina Bhatia.